The fairy type is one of the less common in Yu-Gi-Oh!, associated with pixies, sprites, and godly beings. Despite their holy might, many of these cards have failed to convert not only in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, but even on the playground. So today, we're going to go over some of the worst fairy type monsters in the game. And starting us off at number 10, we have Aurora Paragon. This is a level 4 light fairy with 1500 attack and 1000 defense. It has the effect where neither player can special summon monsters, which at first glance sounds like an insanely broken effect. However, it also has the downside where if either player normal summons a monster, the card is destroyed. If you've spent any time in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community, you've probably heard tales of how terrible cards like Mech and Royal Oppression are, and how important special summoning is. So you may think that the first line of text on Paragon makes it a very powerful card. However, the downside that Paragon comes with makes it so easy to play around that it's more of a detriment than anything. Yes, this does stop your opponent from just throwing a Cashier or Fenrir into play, but it doesn't stop them from just normal summoning their starter. The thing is, almost every deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has at least one card they want to normal summon to start their plays. Sometimes you can get away with playing without your normal summon with the right hands, but generally even then you'll be looking for something to normal summon because it's a powerful resource that you don't want to waste. Basically, this is just a barrier statue that your opponent can out without even going to the battle phase. Speaking of which, it's worth comparing this to other cards that are similar but are easier to work with. Barrier Statue of the Heavens stops players from summoning anything besides light monsters, and like all the other barrier statues, has been a headache thanks to being able to be combined with cards like Moon Mirror Shield, which essentially makes it impossible to beat over in battle. This is very annoying, but not unbeatable. However, Paragon can't even do this because Moon Mirror Shield won't save Paragon from its own effect. The best thing you can do with this is normal summon it and then set a card like Solemn Judgment that can negate normal summons, which is powerful, but you can also do that with the other cards we've mentioned and it's far stronger. Not to mention that, if you're playing like this, you're on stun, so your opponent will just have another turn after this and you'll need another Judgment to keep your Floodgate active. Having to fight this hard over something your opponent gets to do every turn for free is just not a winning strategy. The main reason this card is so low on this list is that, while it is kind of a bad version of Vanity's Emptiness, a bad version of a broken card can still kind of do something. This could, theoretically, really ruin an opponent's day. If your opponent is on a deck like Kashtira that has a lot of monsters that specialize in special summoning themselves and not many normal summons, they could be in a really bad spot. There is one scenario where Aurora Paragon could be really strong actually, and that's if it's combined with broken protection effects in a much lower power level format. This is essentially what happened in our format on Master Duel. By combining it with cards like By Order of the Emperor or Dimension Guardian, you could either turn off the effect that destroys Paragon, or stop it from being destroyed, which would allow it to be a strong floodgate. Normally, this still wouldn't be that big of a deal, but without any super or ultra rare cards, the options for getting around this are a lot more limited. Without powerful options like Harpy's Feather Duster and Lightning Storm, your odds of being able to out these continuous traps protecting Paragon becomes a lot less attractive, and the overall power level of each card is so much lower that it has an easier time taking over games. This was problematic enough that the card had to get banned in the format. However, in every actual competitive format of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Aurora Paragon has been absolutely awful. If Konami starts to support a format like In Our Festival at a competitive level, this could change, but the card is terrible in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! As of right now. Still, the fact that this is the card that could most easily become good means that it can't really be any higher than the 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Wingweaver. This is a level 7 light normal fairy monster with 2750 attack and 2400 defense. Now, on these worst of lists, we try to ignore normal monsters for the most part because they just usually aren't very interesting. Petite Angel is a worse normal summon than just about every monster with an effect, and that's not surprising or interesting to most people to know about. Not to mention, they'd populate the entire list if they were considered. However, in this case, specific circumstances make Wingweaver not just bad, but the worst normal fairy monster in the game, despite having an okay stat line. This is thanks to the cards Herald of Perfection and Advanced Ritual Art. The Herald is a powerful level 6 ritual monster with 1800 attack and 2800 defense. It has the effect where, if your opponent activates a spell or trap card or a monster effect, you can send a fairy monster from your hand to the graveyard to negate the activation and destroy that card. A Herald with a full hand of fairy-type monsters could be almost impossible to defeat, but ritual summoning has always been a clunky and somewhat weak mechanic. To help circumvent this, they made cards like Advanced Ritual Art, which is a ritual spell that can summon any ritual monster from your hand by sending a normal monster whose total levels equal that monster's from your deck to the graveyard. Now, since Herald made you want to play as many fairy monsters as you could, the cards you would want to send with Advanced Ritual Art are normal fairy monsters. So every level 6 or lower normal fairy monster had a use case in being able to be material for this powerful ritual monster. Wingweaver is the only exception to this, as Advanced Ritual Art is worded in such a way that it can't actually be used to summon Herald. You see, Advanced Ritual Art requires the levels of the monsters to be sent exactly to be the level of the ritual monster you're summoning, unlike most ritual spells which require them to be equal or greater than. Herald's normal ritual spell, Dawn of the Herald, also has this restriction by the way, so you can't use Wingweaver for that either. Importantly, Wingweaver is the only level 7 or higher fairy normal monster in the game, meaning it's the only fairy normal monster that can't be used to summon Herald to perfection. This, combined with the fact that level 7 or higher normal monsters are just generally bad, makes Wingweaver the worst normal fairy monster in the game kind of by default. Every other normal fairy monster is more useful just because they work with Advanced Ritual Art into Herald, where even Petite Angel has this distinction. Now, it's worth mentioning that this analysis is a bit outdated. Nowadays, there are other powerful ritual monsters like Herald of Ultimateness that have higher levels, so Wingweaver is more useful there. However, you also have way better ritual spells nowadays too. Most of the time, people summon the Heralds with the Drytron ritual spell if they're playing them, and there's no reason to use normal monsters with that card. At this point, all normal fairy monsters are kinda bad, but there was a time in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where they were worth playing, and at that time, Wingweaver was easily the worst of the entire bunch. And at number 8, we have Majestic Mech Senku. This is a level 4 light fairy effect monster with 1000 attack and 500 defense. It is the effects where, if it deals battle damage to your opponent, you draw 1 card. However, during the end phase of the turn this card was summoned, you have to send it to the graveyard. This is part of a small archetype of Majestic Mechs, all of which have the same effect to send themselves to the graveyard during the end phase. Majestic Mech Oka simply has 2400 attack and is level 6 monster, which can be normal summoned without tributing. And Majestic Mech Goru is a level 8 monster with 2900 attack, with the effect where it can be normal summoned with only 1 tribute, and inflicts piercing battle damage when it battles a defense position monster. Now, all 3 of these monsters are kinda bad. They're essentially more extreme versions of Goblin Attack Force, which is a level 4 monster with 2300 attack, but after it declares an attack, you swap it to defense position, and it can't change its battle position until the end of the next turn. However, where Goblin Attack Force can at least theoretically stick around if your opponent doesn't have a monster to summon, and you can keep it on your field for a few turns, the Majestic Mechs always send themselves to the graveyard during your end phase. They can't even block an attack like the Goblins do. They also combo with fewer cards. Goblin Attack Force can be made better with cards like Skill Drain and Final Attack Orders, which undo its downsides, whereas the Majestic Mechs can only really be comboed with Skill Drain to get around their downsides. However, beyond the entire archetype being quite bad, Senku is an especially hard to use monster. The main purpose of the other 2 Majestic Mechs is to come down and be a big monster by battle, and maybe get some damage in at the same time. Senku can't do that because it only has 1000 attack. To make up for this, it has the effect of drawing you a card to replace itself, which is a nice consolation, but it doesn't really make the card much better. The issue is that actually dealing battle damage to your opponent with Senku is a huge issue because it can't beat anything in battle thanks to having an awful attack stat. The only consistent way to draw a card off of Senku is to summon it on an empty board, which isn't going to happen all that often. Even if you do connect, all you get is 1 card to make up for the 1 card you wasted summoning Senku. Even if we're restricting ourselves to only early cards, any of the recruiters are much better at doing exactly the same thing, being a normal summon that replaces itself. The frustrating thing is that Senku is pretty close to being a good card. If it had a high attack stat, around 1800 or so, or didn't send itself to the graveyard at the end of the turn, it would be extremely powerful in early Yu-Gi-Oh! However, as it is, it requires a ton of setup and will only ever let you stay at parity instead of actually getting card advantage. The card just has too many conditions it needs to fulfill before it can be of any use to really be worth playing. And at number 7, we have Spirit of the Pot of Greed. This is a level 1 light fairy with 100 attack and defense. It is the effect where, while this card is face up in attack position, if a player activates Pot of Greed, they can draw 1 extra card. Pot of Greed is a normal spell with a very complicated effect, where when you activate it, you draw 2 cards. Now, there are some weird things you have to acknowledge when talking about this card. primarily that the card existed entirely to work with a card that is now banned. However, there was a period of time where both of these cards were legal. However, even then, Pot of Greed was limited to one copy. You could use cards like Magician of Faith to recycle your Pot of Greed though, so you could get multiple uses out of your spirit that way. The main issue with Spirit of the Pot of Greed is that you need to use multiple Pot of Greeds with it in play in order to actually get card advantage off of the card. You could use it to only cycle, but wasting your normal summon on a 100 attack and defense monster to cycle is pretty bad considering there are cards like Dekochi the Battle Chanted Locomotive or Jar of Greed, which could cycle without taking up your normal summon, or while just putting up a better monster. This is a pretty big ask considering that not only is Pot of Greed limited in these time periods, but you could easily draw your Pot of Greed far before you draw your spirit, and now all your spirits are mostly useless. Even if you did want to try and use this to draw a ton of cards in one turn by chaining Pot of Greeds together somehow, you'd probably get more mileage out of something like Royal Magical Library. However, the biggest downside of this card is that it's symmetrical. If your opponent activates a Pot of Greed while this is on the field, which they will be playing at the time when this card is legal, they'll get to draw 3 cards for their one pot, which is kind of insane. This downside is bad enough that you'd reconsider playing this card due to this alone, as any value you get out of cycling off of your spirit pales in comparison to the free card it could give your opponent. Somehow, this isn't even the only monster that exists in this specific niche of card that exists to make Pot of Greed marginally better. Avatar the Pot is a level 3 monster with 1200 attack with the effect where you can discard a Pot of Greed to draw 3 cards. The main upside here are the better stats and the fact that it's not symmetrical, so your opponent can't also draw 3 off of their pots. You can't stack this effect like you can Spirit, but let's be real, you're never going to keep a Spirit of the Pot on field for more than one turn, so this upside isn't really relevant. Considering how completely outclassed Spirit of the Pot is, it's pretty obvious that no one should ever bother sleeving one up. And at number 6, we have Ma'at. This is a level 10 light fairy, and it can't be normal summoned or set, and must be special summoned by sending a light dragon monster and a light fairy monster you control to the graveyard, and it can't be special summoned by other means. Once per turn, you can declare 3 card names. Then excavate the top 3 cards of your deck. Add each card you correctly named to your hand, and send the rest to the graveyard. Then you can make its attack and defense each become equal to the number of cards you added to your hand with its effect. Ma'at is a card that sounds like it could potentially be very powerful, but it's far too conditional to really accomplish anything. The main issue is that, on top of having a pretty specific summoning condition, its effect is extremely random. If you name 3 cards that you have full 3 ofs in your deck and use this effect on turn 1, which is quite difficult, you have about a 60% chance to hit 1 of the 3 cards you named, but only a 15% chance to draw 2. If you only hit once, then you're kinda just spinning your wheels. Lots of cards can add a card from deck to hand on summon, and they don't require sending cards from your field to the graveyard to do it, much less specific materials like Ma'at does. While there are quite a lot of light dragons and light fairies you can summon, there aren't many strategies that are good at putting up a ton of materials of these specific types and attributes at the same time. One or the other is easy. Both at once is a challenge. So you're putting in more work to summon this than most other cards that let you find another card in your deck and has a chance to whiff completely about 50% of the time. And the only upside is a pretty small chance of being able to get 2 cards from your deck instead of 1. There's even more downsides we haven't gone over yet. You'll only realistically hit 1 card, so your stats will be set to the low 1000, which is pretty easy to beat over. Keeping Ma'at around for several turns is a no-go as a result, so trying to use the effect multiple times is very unlikely. There's also no guarantee that the card you draw will be the one you actually need. This is especially relevant because being able to attempt to draw non-engine is one of the biggest upsides of Ma'at's draw effect. But it's so inconsistent in this role that you can't rely on it. That's the general theme of the card. Potentially powerful, but so inconsistent that it's never actually worth using. And at number 5, we have Scourge Enrise. This is a level 8 light fairy with 2400 attack and 1500 defense. It can't be normal summoned or set, and can only be special summoned by banishing 3 light fairies and 1 dark fiend monster from your graveyard. It is the effect where, once per turn, you can banish 1 card on the field, but it can't attack this turn. Now, Scourge is a really disappointing card, because it has a decent effect. It's just ruined by its summoning condition, which is one of the most specific conditions you could possibly put on a monster. Requiring you to banish 4 monsters from your graveyard is a lot, but 4 monsters with specific types and attributes is just backbreaking. There are good light fairies and dark fiends, of course. You have generically playable cards like Sangan and Tour Guide from the Underworld for the dark fiend portion, and there are light fairies such as Artifact and Cyberangel archetypes, the Heralds, and some more that we don't really have time to go over. The issue is that they don't really work all that well together. Most of the fairy cards want to work with other fairies or light monsters, and the dark fiends are the same. You basically have to jam a few dark fiends into a fairy deck and just kind of hope you draw them in the right ratios to try and summon this card. You almost have to wonder why they were so scared of this card in the first place. And then you remember that this card came out in 2008. At this time, Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning was on the ban list. And this is basically just Scourge Enrise, but a million times better. It only needs you to banish 1 light and 1 dark monster, regardless of types, to special summon itself out of your hand, and also has the effect to target a monster in the field and banish it, but has to skip attack in the turn it does this. It can't banish back row though, and it can make a second attack each turn if it destroys a monster by battle. Considering this card was strong enough to get banned, you can sort of understand why Konami was so careful with Sky Scourge. A version of this card was considered to be so strong it couldn't be allowed in the game at the time, so they decided to nerf it substantially by making it very difficult to summon. Unfortunately, they nerfed the card far too much. It is worth bringing up this card's twin, Scourge Enrise. This card requires banishing 3 Dark Fiends and 1 Light Fairy to summon, and lets you pay 1,000 life points to send all cards on the field in both players' hands to the graveyard, then draw 1 card. This card is also kind of weak thanks to how difficult it is to summon, but its effect is so stupidly strong in the right scenario that players have still tried to make it work here and there. It's the kind of card that could theoretically make a comeback even today if a deck comes along that can search it out and set up its summon condition on the first turn, because stripping your opponent's entire hand on turn 1 is just that strong. With that in mind, Enrise looks even more disappointing. You have to do the exact same amount of work, and all you get is a worse version of Primite Drill Beam for your efforts. Enrise was a card that was caught in a hard place, having an effect that was overhauled and being a mirror version of a card with an effect that actually did need a restriction this harsh to be printed, which led to it having a ridiculously high cost for how good its effect actually was. And at number 4, we have Kotodama. This is a level 3 fairy with 0 attack and 1600 defense. It is the effect where, as long as it's face up on the field, you destroy all monsters with the same name as another face up monster. This is an interesting effect, but one that's not likely to have that much of an impact on the average game. Most decks aren't going to be summoning the same monster several times on a turn, and even if they are, they're unlikely to have multiple copies of the same card on the field at the same time, which is the only time Kotodama does anything. For an example, you could go through multiple copies of Destiny Hero Malicious, which can banish itself from the grave to special summon another copy of itself from the deck. It's common in decks like Hero for a player to summon Malicious, link it off for another monster, and then banish Malicious from your graveyard to summon another. Basically, every other combo that runs through multiple copies of a card works the same way. The only decks this effect really does anything against are decks that rely on having a card with a very specific name card on the field. For example, Cyber Dragon or Harpy Ladies has a strategy. However, even against these strategies, you're not likely to actually stop them completely. This is because of Kotodama's second major weakness, which is that it's an extremely easy to destroy card. 0 attack on a monster with no way of special summoning itself in defense position means that literally any monster in the game with more than 0 attack, which is almost all of them, can walk over it. Even if you do catch an opponent out with Kotodama, they can probably just attack over it with whatever monster they've summoned. You could use the classic Moon Mirror Shield to protect it, and if your opponent can't find a way to remove it, that could let it stick around. However, this is assuming your opponent is one of those 3 decks in the game that actually gets disrupted by this effect. The only real use of Kotodama is answering tokens from cards like Scapegoat, as they do technically have the same name as each other. However, back in the day, the best answer to Scapegoat was a Sewer Priest, which could attack each of these tokens once, and had a chance to beat over other monsters your opponent summoned, whereas Kotodama could really only counter Scapegoat and nothing else. Not to mention that back then, having 0 attack was an even bigger drawback. Kotodama is a potentially interesting card, but its effect is just far too specific to actually have an impact on the average game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, no matter the time period. And at number 3, we have Little Fairy. This is a level 3 light fairy with 800 attack and defense. It is the effect where, up to twice per turn, you can send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard to increase its level by 1 until the end of the turn. Now, a big issue with Fairy here is that increasing the level of a monster, simply put, doesn't do anything on its own. The main two uses of this kind of effect are helping you summon Synchro and Xyz monsters. Synchros requiring adding 2 or more monsters so their combined levels equals the Synchro monster's level. And to summon an Xyz monster, you need 2 or more monsters with a level equal to that monster's rank. So increasing a monster's level can make it so that you can summon a monster of a higher level or rank from your extra deck, which can be mildly useful. However, the only time these kinds of cards have ever really seen play is when they also do something else that's actually powerful. For example, look at Unizombie. This is a level 3 zombie tuner that has the very similar effect to discard 1 card and increase the level of the monster in the field by 1, but also allows you to send a zombie card from your deck to the graveyard to increase the level of a target by 1, and each of these effects are once per turn. Unizombie's ability to send a monster from your deck to the graveyard has a ton of value on it thanks to cards like Mizuki, a zombie which can banish itself from the grave to target a zombie monster in your grave and special summon it to the field. This also makes the effect to discard a card from your hand way more valuable, as it allows you to discard a zombie card and then revive it with Mizuki later. This gives every bit of Unizombie a ton of versatility, and the opportunity to make plays. Little Fairy can't do any of that. Unless you happen to have a monster reborn in hand, or a card that wants to be sent to the graveyard anyway, you're going to be giving up an entire card for very little value. The ability to do this twice doesn't really change anything. In fact, letting you do this more than once at all is kind of a downside, because it may trick some players into misplaying if they see that they can lose 2 cards to make a synchro play. The card offers a choice between one of the most valuable resources in Yu-Gi-Oh!, cards in hand, for something that can barely be considered a resource at all, increasing the level of a monster. It's almost completely useless. You'd be better off ignoring its effect in almost every situation. And at number 2, we have Spirit of the Breeze. This is a level 3 wind fairy with 0 attack and 1800 defense. It is the effect where, during each of your standby phases, if this card is in face-up attack position, you gain 1000 life points. There's a lot of problems with this effect, but the main one is that gaining 1000 life points a turn just isn't very good on the face of it. Life points famously don't really matter in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are a lot of cards that you can point to prove this, Solemn Judgment making you pay half your life points to stop a single card, being a great example why protecting your life points isn't all that crucial. A really good comparison for Spirit of the Breeze is actually the card Snatch Steal. This equip spell equips to an opponent's monster and gives you control of it for as long as you control Snatch Steal. However, it has the downside of giving your opponent 1000 life points during each of their standby phases. Essentially, it gives them Spirit of the Breeze's effect for free in exchange for stealing one of their monsters. Snatch Steal was an amazing card for a long time in the TCG, needing to be banned for a number of years to keep the format healthy. The downside of giving your opponent life points ended up not mattering at all, because you got a monster that could almost always deal way more damage to them than they could ever heal. That principle also applies to Spirit of the Breeze, as the life points it gives you will never make up for the fact that you just normal summoned a card that did absolutely nothing. Even worse, Spirit of the Breeze has to be in attack position, meaning that any monster can not only attack it and destroy it, but also inflict battle damage to you equal to whatever their attack is. This will almost always be more than 1000, so you are quite literally taking more damage than you gain back in life points by playing this card. Even back in the day when you could try and play a slow card like Spirit, the card was just far too inefficient. Even less aggressive monsters like Exile Force can punish normal summoning Spirit really harshly. All in all, Spirit of the Breeze is a card that will basically never do anything worthwhile. Still, its upside is slightly higher than the number 1 card on this list. And at number 1, we have Fairy Guardian. This is a level 3 wind fairy with 1000 attack and defense. It has the effect where you contribute this card to put a spell card sent to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect this turn on the bottom of your deck. This is a really hard card to explain why it's bad, because it's difficult to even analyze what the hypothetical use case was supposed to be in the first place. Even activating the effect can be quite difficult. For it to activate, your opponent has to send one of your spell cards to the grave during your own turn, which isn't going to happen that often. Even if that does happen, we have to get to the next question. What's the point of putting a card from your graveyard onto the bottom of your deck? Spell cards aren't exactly easy to get back from your graveyard, as most cards that return them from the graveyard to your hand have a pretty hefty cost. However, the bottom of your deck isn't exactly a much more convenient place for a key spell to be. Unless that spell is an archetypal one which can be searched by a monster you have in hand, putting it on the bottom of your deck isn't making it more accessible. Also, if you have the ability to search a copy of that spell from your deck, you could just do that. You're probably playing more than just one copy of that card unless it's one of the few limited archetypal spells. So you could just search your second or third copy of that card instead, and Fairy Guardian wouldn't have helped you at all. Trying to come up with a situation where this effect is even beneficial is a puzzle into itself. Never mind coming up with a situation where normal summoning this monster from your hand, and then tributing it to do so is actually a good play. Fairy Guardian is the only fairy monster that can't really do anything in almost any situation. Spirit of the Breeze can save you if you really need life point gain over the course of several turns, and you can protect it with Floodgate. And Little Fairy can help you make a high level synchro monster if the situation really calls for it. There is no practical situation, even in lower powered level Yu-Gi-Oh!, where Fairy Guardian's effect would ever be useful. It's a truly awful card, outclassed by essentially every other fairy monster ever printed.